She was trying to unlock my car with a key that did not belong to her, and when it refused to turn, she called the police. That morning, peace died right there on my front steps. I froze in place, one hand still holding a steaming cup of coffee, the other not yet resting on the porch railing. Just a few steps away from me, a woman in a light-colored cardigan was bent over the driver's door of my black pickup truck. She jammed a shiny brass key into the lock, twisted it hard, pulled it out, then shoved it back in again, as if the vehicle itself were an enemy that needed to be conquered. She spun around the moment she heard the door open. Her eyes were sharp, her face flushed red with a mix of anger and excitement.
"Why won't the community key open your vehicle?"
she shouted, her voice high-pitched and filled with confidence.
"This is a serious violation of HOA safety regulations."
I had not said a single word yet. In truth, I was still trying to understand how a complete stranger could be standing on my private driveway, using her own key to try to open my car, and somehow feel confident enough to blame me for it. She did not wait for an answer. With a decisive motion, she pulled out her phone, dialed a number, and locked her eyes on me as if I were the most dangerous suspect in a Reddit story she was already writing in her head. "Hello, I need the police immediately," she said loudly, making sure the entire neighborhood could hear. "There is an uncooperative man preventing a mandatory HOA safety inspection. He is behaving aggressively." Her manicured finger pointed straight at me. I stood there in my house clothes, coffee in hand, and suddenly I was the villain in my own driveway. That was the moment I knew this was not just another ordinary HOA Karen. This was the beginning of one of the wildest HOA Karen stories I had ever witnessed, and ironically, I was standing right at the center of it. Her name was Melissa Grant, the HOA president of Oak Ridge Commons. She lived 3 houses down from me, the woman who had spent nearly 2 years trying to turn my life into a constant stream of invisible violation notices. The first time she ever came to speak to me, she did not greet me. No smile, no small talk. She stood at the edge of my driveway, clutching a clipboard to her chest like a shield, and stared at my pickup truck as if it were a personal insult. "Vehicles like that make the community feel uneasy," she had said back then. "The HOA needs to ensure visual harmony." Harmony, in her dictionary, meant that everything had to exist under her control. The problem was that my house sat squarely in the gray zone, close enough to the HOA that she could see my yard from her kitchen window, yet far enough outside their authority that legally she could do nothing about it. And that fact drove her crazy. From homemade violation slips taped to my windshield for unauthorized government imagery, to long-winded emails about negative visual impact, everything slowly escalated. I had seen this pattern before in Reddit stories, had heard hundreds of Karen stories like it, but when it happens to you, right outside your own front door, it feels completely different. And then came this morning, the community key, the call to the police, the victorious look on her face when the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. A patrol car turned into the cul-de-sac. She smiled, straightened her back, as if justice itself had finally chosen her side. I could see it in her eyes, the satisfaction of someone who believed power was standing right behind her. The officer stepped out of the car. He looked at her, then looked at me. A very small pause. Subtle, almost invisible, but enough for me to notice the change in his expression. "What seems to be the problem, ma'am?" he asked. She launched into her explanation, fast, breathless, and dramatic. This man, the vehicle, non-compliance, safety inspection, HOA authority, community risk. The officer turned toward me. His gaze met mine, then dropped to the coffee cup in my hand, then rose back to my face. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone completely different. Silence fell. The air grew thick. Melissa Grant blinked. Once. Then, again. As if her mind were trying to load information it had never prepared for. I took a sip of my coffee. Hot, bitter, real. And in that moment, I knew her game had only just begun. But she had chosen the wrong opponent from the very first move. She did not stop after calling the police. In fact, that was only the opening shot. That same afternoon, before the sun had even slipped behind the identical rooftops of Oak Ridge Commons, I heard the sharp sound of paper being slapped against the light pole in front of my house. The noise was dry and urgent, carrying the familiar energy of someone who believed they were doing the right thing for the community. I stepped outside and watched from a distance as bright pink flooded the entire street. Flyers, sparkling with glitter glue, were plastered onto every mailbox, every trash bin, every street sign, as if someone were trying to turn the entire neighborhood into their personal bulletin board. The headline was printed in all capital letters, shaky but determined, "Urgent Community Action." Underneath it was my name, unhidden, unapologetic. My vehicle was labeled a threat. My refusal to comply was described as antisocial behavior. And the solution she proposed was chilling in its simplicity. Every vehicle in the area must provide emergency access to the HOA. A community key. No exceptions. That was when I understood. Melissa Grant did not just want to control my truck. She wanted to control the idea of power in this neighborhood. Ted, my neighbor from across the street, knocked on my door just as dusk settled in. His brow was furrowed, the flyer in his hand crumpled and worn. "Is this about you?" he asked quietly, his voice tired. "I think so," I said. He let out a dry laugh. "She fined me last week because my car was too red. Said it was visually aggressive. I thought I was just unlucky." No, Ted was not the only one. I started hearing other stories. A car parked in the wrong shadow. A license plate with numbers deemed hostile. Violations that had never existed. Written down with the certainty of someone used to giving orders. That is how HOA Karen stories usually begin. Small, petty, and then suddenly, everything spirals out of control. That night, my inbox filled up. Emails from Melissa. The tone was cold, dressed up as legal language, but soaked in threat. She quoted vague clauses. She talked about safety. She talked about community responsibility. And through all of it, she never mentioned one critical detail: that my house did not fall under HOA authority. The next morning, I found a yellow slip tucked under my windshield wiper. Violation notice. Processing fee. Administrative fee. The reason was excessive vehicle presence. In my own driveway. I stood there for a long moment, watching the paper flutter slightly in the breeze. I was not angry. I was not surprised. It was a familiar feeling. The feeling you get when you realize someone has gone too far and has no idea how far they are about to fall. Melissa did not slow down. She called an emergency HOA meeting. I was not invited, but the recording was sent to me just a few hours later. In the video, she stood at the front of the room under harsh fluorescent lights, her face tense, her eyes bright with every sharp movement of her hands. A pie chart appeared on the screen behind her, with most of it labeled as "my truck." The leading cause of community instability. She talked about size, color, symbols of authority, non-compliance. Someone in the room asked quietly, "Isn't that a law enforcement vehicle?" Melissa snapped back instantly. "Authority does not exempt anyone from community standards." I turned off the video, not out of anger, but because I had seen enough. I saw what others had not yet recognized. This was a systematic escalation, no longer emotional, no longer impulsive. This was a plan. I started documenting everything, not as an annoyed neighbor, but as someone who understood how Reddit stories like this usually end when abuse of power goes unchecked. I photographed every flyer, saved every email, recorded every meeting, spoke with every person who had been targeted. Melissa believed I was just a man she could underestimate. A quiet homeowner, a large truck in a small neighborhood. She believed the louder voice would win, that more paperwork would create real power. She did not realize that in all that noise, she was exposing everything. And when real authority finally meets fabricated power, there is only one outcome. But at that moment, she had no idea. And that is exactly what made the next chapter unavoidable. She wanted my car keys. Not to ask, not to negotiate. She demanded them, as if they were an obvious right that I had deliberately stolen from her. That afternoon, just as I had finished parking, and before I even turned off the engine, Melissa Grant appeared at the end of my driveway. She walked quickly, her heels striking the concrete in the steady rhythm of absolute confidence. In her hands was a thick white envelope, the front printed with a title she had clearly typed and retyped many times before finally hitting print. Community Vehicle Safety Program. She did not greet me. She did not waste time. The HOA requires every household to submit a set of vehicle keys, she said, holding the envelope out toward me. Strictly for emergency use. I looked at the envelope. Then I looked at her. No, I said. Just one word. But it landed between us like a stone thrown straight into still water. Melissa blinked. Her eyebrow twitched. Not from surprise, but from offense. She was not used to being refused. You don't understand how serious this is, she said, her voice dropping into the tone of someone who believed they were educating an idiot. If there is a fire, an accident, or a security threat, the HOA needs immediate access. To my vehicle, I said slowly. To all vehicles in the area, she corrected quickly. I shook my head. No. There was a very brief, very real moment when Melissa's polite expression slipped, revealing something raw underneath. Not concern for the community, but the anger of someone who had just been challenged in front of an invisible audience inside her own mind. We will revisit this, she said, turning away, her shoulders tense. I knew that tone. It was not a promise. It was a threat. And just as I expected, only a few hours later, the entire neighborhood seemed to be covered by a hastily assembled campaign. New notices appeared, thicker this time, longer, filled with borrowed legal language. She called it a vehicle harmony initiative. I called it a nightmare printed on colored paper. The content went far beyond keys. It talked about order, about collective rights, about individuals making room for the greater good. And my name appeared again and again, enough that anyone reading would understand I was the final obstacle between Melissa and her dream of control. The HOA meeting that night was unusually crowded. I was not there, but I did not need to be to know what happened. The video was sent to me later that evening. Melissa stood at the front of the room, remote in hand, the projector light reflecting off her face and making her eyes shine with theatrical intensity. She displayed images of my truck, from multiple angles, close, far, some cropped, some blurry. Here, she said, pointing at the screen. This is a prime example of a non-compliant vehicle. A list appeared. Oversized dimensions, threatening color, symbols of authority, refusal to cooperate. Each line was a thin blade, cutting into the collective consciousness. A woman seated in the back raised her hand, her voice hesitant. But isn't that a law enforcement vehicle? Melissa turned, her smile thin as paper. Authority does not place anyone above the community. That sentence silenced the room. And in that moment, I knew it was not only me who heard the warning. A few others had begun to hear it too. Ted, Jill, the people who had been fined for ridiculous reasons. I saw them in the video. Their eyes were no longer lowered. They were looking at Melissa. Not with fear, but with doubt. I stopped the video and sat in my kitchen. The yellow light cast the shadow of an empty coffee cup against the wall. I thought about the Reddit stories I had read, about how situations like this always escalate when fabricated authority goes unchecked, and about what Melissa did not know. She thought I was just a man refusing to cooperate. A vehicle that would not open. A selfish individual in a story she was writing herself. She did not know that I was used to far more intense situations than this. She did not know that I had been trained to recognize the moment someone begins to cross legal boundaries. And she did not know that every piece of paper she handed out, every word she spoke, was quietly turning into evidence. When I stood up to turn off the light, I no longer felt under attack. I could see a clear path opening in front of me. Melissa had chosen to escalate, and I knew that once escalation begins, no one walks away halfway through without paying a price. The police did not arrive to arrest me. They arrived to find out why someone would dare call them over a car that refused to unlock. The siren cut through the already tense morning, short and decisive. A patrol car rolled slowly into the cul-de-sac, its tires humming against the asphalt with each deliberate turn. Melissa Grant straightened her posture and adjusted her shoulders. Her face lit with the confident glow of someone certain they were standing on the right side of power. I remained on my porch. My coffee had gone cold, not because I forgot to drink it, but because I was waiting to see what would happen when the story Melissa had created collided with reality. The officer stepped out of the car. Young, calm. His eyes swept the scene before settling on my pickup truck, where fresh scratch marks still showed on the lock from a key that did not belong there. "What seems to be the problem, ma'am?" he asked. Melissa did not wait even half a second. She stepped forward, her voice high, fast, polished, as if she had rehearsed it in front of a mirror. "This man, refusing inspection, HOA violations, suspicious behavior, community safety risk." Each phrase was punctuated by a sharp finger, pointed directly at me, as if I were a dangerous threat standing before an invisible courtroom. The officer turned toward me. His gaze paused for a fraction of a moment. Just a fraction. But I saw it clearly. He was not looking at me like an accused man. He was looking at me like someone he recognized. "Are you all right?" he asked. Melissa froze. Just for a moment. Very brief, but long enough for the air around us to shift. "I'm fine," I replied evenly. "I'm just standing on my own property." The officer nodded, then turned back to Melissa. "Ma'am, did he threaten you in any way?" Melissa opened her mouth, then closed it. She swallowed. "He's not cooperating," she said, her voice noticeably less certain. "And this vehicle doesn't comply with HOA safety procedures." The officer looked at the truck again, then at me, then back at Melissa. "Do you know who he is?" End quote. The question dropped into the street like a heavy stone. Melissa frowned. "He's a resident who isn't part of the HOA but lives next to our area," she said, as if that answer should have ended the discussion. The officer took a breath. Deliberate, intentional. "Ma'am," he said, his voice slowing and lowering, "this is Ethan Brooks." Melissa looked at me. Her eyes flicked from my face to the truck, then back again. I saw irritation there. Not fear, but annoyance at having her time wasted. "And?" she asked. "And he is my direct commanding officer," the officer continued. "He's the person I report to every shift." The silence that followed was no ordinary silence. It was heavy, dense, as if the air itself had been pulled out of the neighborhood. Melissa blinked. Once, then twice. Her mouth parted, but no sound came out. I saw it clearly. The exact moment her carefully constructed story collapsed from the inside without anyone needing to push. "He is," she whispered. "He is what?" I stepped down, one porch step. Not fast, not slow. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to boast. The truth carried enough weight on its own. "I'm the one ultimately responsible for calls like the one you made this morning," I said. "Including yours." Melissa's face went pale. Her hands tightened around the clipboard until her knuckles showed white. I watched a series of emotions flash through her eyes. Shock, denial, then the most dangerous one of all, anger. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, her voice rising. "I was just doing my HOA duties." The officer shook his head. "Ma'am, you called the police over a legally parked vehicle on private property with no indication of a crime." Melissa opened her mouth to argue, but this time, no one stepped in to save her from her own words. She turned and walked away, her steps quick, her heels striking the pavement as if trying to outrun something invisible. Before getting into her car, she looked back at me. That look was no longer confident. It was sharp, cold, and filled with the promise of someone who was not used to losing. As her car pulled away, the cul-de-sac fell quiet again. But it was not the quiet of an ending. It was the quiet before another storm. The officer stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Are you okay?" I nodded. But inside, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Melissa Grant had just been exposed by her own story. And people like her, when they lose their sense of control, never stop. They only climb higher, shout louder, and next time, take bigger risks. I watched the road where her car disappeared, and I knew the hardest part of this story was still ahead. That morning, I woke up to find my driveway marked like the scene of a land grab. Bright orange plastic stakes were planted in perfect lines along the entrance to my home, evenly spaced, cold and deliberate, as if someone had spent the entire evening measuring every step. Attached to each stake was a small tag, bold lettering, unsigned, yet dripping with arrogance. Area under HOA vehicle. Access review. Proposed gate installation. I stood there for a long time. Not angry, not shocked. Just a heavy weight settling in my chest. This was no longer about fines or threatening emails. This was trespassing. Direct. Intentional. I bent down and pulled one stake from the ground. The soil was still damp, proof they had been placed there recently. There were footprints nearby. Small, neat, square heels. I recognized them immediately. Melissa Grant. She had crossed a line she had always pretended to respect. Less than 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. A message from Jill. "Have you seen your driveway yet?" She's completely lost it. Before I could reply, Ted sent a photo from across the street. The angle showed my entire driveway outlined as if it were contested public property. Melissa did not appear right away. She liked creating gaps, letting others worry, speculate, fill in the blanks themselves. That was how she maintained control. But I knew she would come. And she did. The sound of heels echoed from the end of the street. Steady, firm. She walked toward me, clipboard pressed to her chest, sunglasses hiding half her face. A thin smile rested on her lips, the smile of someone who believed they were shaping history. "Good morning," she said lightly, as if we were chatting about the weather. "I'm standing on my own land," I replied. "For now," she corrected instantly. "The HOA has initiated a vehicle access evaluation process for community safety." I looked at the orange stakes. "You placed these yourself?" "Of course," she said without hesitation. "We need to mark the perimeter before installing a gate." A gate. The word rang in my head like an alarm bell. "You don't have the authority." "Not yet," she replied quickly. "But we will. I'm drafting a new amendment to the HOA bylaws. We'll put it to a vote. On my driveway. Property lines are flexible when safety is involved," she said with a shrug. That sentence sent a chill through me. Not because I was afraid, but because I had heard similar words in the worst case files. When someone starts treating the law as something that can be bent by language, they never stop at plastic stakes. "I'm removing them," I said. "You shouldn't," she replied, her voice dropping. "Interfering with HOA procedures could be considered obstruction." I looked straight at her. "You're standing on private property. You're trespassing." Melissa smiled. Not wide, not small. "We'll let the law decide." Then she turned away, leaving my driveway torn apart by symbols of fabricated authority. That afternoon, I got to work. Not in anger, but with absolute clarity. I photographed every stake, every footprint, every attached tag. I called the planning department and obtained precise boundary maps. I printed the original HOA bylaws and highlighted every line related to jurisdiction. I wrote down Melissa's exact words, sentence by sentence, while my memory was still sharp. Neighbors began stopping by, quietly. No gatherings. No noise. Just looks. Nods. Ted stood by the fence and spoke softly. "She has no right to do this." Jill sighed. "She's trying to make an example out of you." I knew that. And I knew something more important. When someone tries to build a gate on your land, they're not just trying to control access. They're trying to control you. Night fell. The orange stakes reflected the streetlights, looking like open wounds that had not yet healed. I watched them from my living room window, one hand resting on a stack of documents that had grown thick fast. Melissa thought the morning police call had failed, but the conflict had not. She was wrong. The moment she drove those stakes into my ground, the conflict had already begun. From that point on, nothing she did was just HOA nuisance anymore. It had become a chain of legal mistakes, waiting to be connected into a complete picture. I turned off the lights. Outside, the driveway was still marked, but in my mind, every boundary had never been clearer. And I knew the next move Melissa made would not involve plastic stakes. It would be louder, bolder, and far more dangerous for her. I knew something was wrong the moment the tow truck parked sideways across my driveway, its engine still running. The driver standing there looking uneasy, like he had been hired to do something he did not fully believe was legal. That afternoon the sun was harsh, light slamming straight down onto the concrete, making the orange stakes glare painfully bright. I had just stepped outside when I saw the driver holding a piece of paper, glancing back and forth between it and my pickup truck. He did not look at me first. He looked at the emblem on the truck door. Only then did he look up. "Sorry, sir," he said hesitantly. "Someone from the HOA called me, said this vehicle was abandoned and needed to be removed immediately." I looked at him, then at the tow truck, then back at my driveway. "That's my truck," I said, "parked on my property." He scratched his head. "She said she had authority. Said if I didn't do it, she'd report me for breach of contract." She, Melissa Grant. I exhaled slowly. I did not raise my voice. I was not angry. I simply pointed at the truck door. "Do you see that?" The familiar emblem reflected in the sunlight. The driver's face went pale. "Oh, I didn't know. She didn't say anything about this." "I figured," I replied. He scrambled back into the cab, started the engine, and pulled away so fast the tires kicked up dust. A failed test run, but I knew Melissa would not stop there. People like her do not accept the word no. They just change their approach. And sure enough, the next morning, I stepped outside and saw something that made my stomach drop. A bright yellow wheel clamp, large and heavy, locked tightly around the front tire of my pickup truck. Cold metal. Brutal. Hanging from it was a laminated plastic tag with bold lettering. Non-compliant vehicle. Release fee, $390. I stood there for a long time, not because I was surprised, but because I was witnessing another line being crossed. No more paperwork. No more threats. This was enforcement. "Looks like you finally learned to respect authority." Melissa's voice came from behind me. She stood there with her arms crossed, eyes gleaming. No more fake politeness, no more safety excuses, just the satisfaction of someone who believed they had won. "You put this on my truck," I said. "The HOA made a decision," she replied, "after repeated violations. This is a corrective community measure." "Where did you buy it?" "Online," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "Heavy duty, high quality." I laughed. Not loudly, not mockingly, just a short, dry laugh. "Take it off." "No," she snapped. "You'll pay the release fee like everyone else. Everyone else doesn't get booted on their own property." "Because no one else is as stubborn as you," she shouted, her voice cracking. I did not argue anymore. I pulled out my phone, dialed a familiar number, and requested assistance. Not as a personal favor. By the book. The patrol car arrived 10 minutes later. The officer stepped out, looked at the wheel clamp, then looked at me. His expression changed immediately. "What's going on here?" he asked. Melissa rushed forward. "Finally. Arrest him. He's refusing to comply with HOA regulations and interfering with lawful enforcement." The officer turned to her and paused for a beat. "Did you put this on the vehicle?" "Yes. Under HOA authority." "There is no such authority," he said, his voice dropping. "You are interfering with property outside the HOA. This is trespassing." Melissa froze. "That can't be right. This is for the community." "Remove it," he said. "Right now." She shook her head, then looked at me, then back at the officer. Hesitation flashed across her face, then hardened into anger. She yanked at the clamp, struggling for a long moment before finally getting it off. The metal hit the ground with a sharp, ugly sound. No one clapped. No one cheered. There was only the heavy silence of someone realizing they had gone too far. Melissa picked up the clamp and turned away. Her steps were no longer confident. But I saw something else in her walk. Not regret. A twisted determination from someone who had been stopped, but not defeated. The officer looked at me. "You all right?" I nodded. But inside, I knew exactly what had happened. That wheel clamp had not just locked a tire. It had locked Melissa Grant's fate onto a path with no return. From the moment metal hit concrete, this was no longer an HOA dispute. It had become a legal matter. A real one. Impossible to avoid. I looked at my truck, now free. But I saw something else too. A storm was coming. And this time, no one would be able to say they had not been warned. She came back just 2 days later, this time not carrying plastic stakes or a wheel clamp, but something far more dangerous. Paperwork. That morning, when I opened my mailbox, a stack of glossy brochures slid out and fell at my feet. Thick paper. Full-color printing. Professionally designed to the point that, if I had not known better, I would have assumed it was an official city document. On the cover was a new name, printed in bold, ambitious letters. Neighborhood Vehicle Coordination Council. I stood still and read every line. The more I read, the slower my heartbeat became. Not out of fear, but because a cold clarity was taking shape. Melissa had not backed down. She had changed tactics. The brochure talked about order, about harmony, about a voluntary initiative to ensure vehicle safety within the neighborhood. It all sounded harmless. But on the final page, neatly folded at the bottom, there was one line that made me laugh out loud. Harmony contribution fee. $89. A payment code that led directly to a personal account. There was no longer any doubt. This was not the HOA. This was a fake organization. My phone buzzed nonstop that morning. Jill called first, her voice low and urgent. "You got this too." "Right." Ted texted right after. "She's handing them out to the whole neighborhood. Says anyone who doesn't pay could face vehicle restrictions." I spread all the papers across my dining table. The brochure, a new violation notice, a small slip fining me $13 for failing to acknowledge receipt of the notice, an absurdly specific amount, chosen less for reason and more to assert arbitrary authority. Melissa was no longer pretending this was about the HOA. She was building her own paper kingdom, where she wrote the rules, collected the money, and passed judgment. And the most dangerous part was that a few people in the neighborhood were starting to believe her. That afternoon, Jill knocked on my door. She brought no documents with her, only exhaustion. "The board is fed up," she said. "But we need clear evidence. Not emotions. Not outrage." I nodded. "I have it." We sat around my dining table. Not many of us. No noise. Just a handful of people who were all too familiar with being targeted. I opened each folder one by one. The first police call that morning. The threatening emails. The orange stakes. The tow truck. The wheel clamp. And now, the fake council. Each person saw a part of the story they had never known. Ted shook his head when he saw the photo of the wheel clamp. Jill closed her eyes when she read about the payment going to a personal account. No one spoke for several seconds. There was no need. Everything was clear. "We need a meeting," Jill said. "And this time, she won't control it." The HOA meeting took place on Friday night. The community room was more crowded than usual. Melissa arrived late, as always. She wore a sharp outfit, clipboard held tight, her eyes scanning the room like she was inspecting territory. When she stood up to speak, Jill was already standing at the front. "No," Jill said calmly but firmly. "Tonight the board will run the meeting." Melissa froze. "I'm the president." "Until the vote is finished," Jill replied. I stepped forward. Not rushed, not loud. I did not introduce myself by title. I simply said I was a resident who had documented everything that had happened over the past weeks. Then, I turned on the projector. The first image was the brochure. The second was the payment code. The third was the personal account. I heard murmurs spread across the room. Melissa started to speak, but no one was listening anymore. "This organization is not registered," I said. "Collecting money this way is illegal." And the earlier actions, from wheel clamps to threats of vehicle restriction, were never within HOA authority. Melissa shouted from the front row. "You have no right to accuse me." "I'm not accusing," I replied. "I'm presenting facts." One person stood up. Then another. People who had stayed silent, who had kept their heads down. Now they spoke, not in anger, but with specific stories of fines, threats, and coercion. Finally, Jill raised her hand. "We vote." No one hesitated. Arms went up, unified, and decisive. Melissa sat frozen. The clipboard slipped from her hands and hit the floor with a dry, hollow sound. "The motion passes," Jill said. "Melissa Grant is removed from the position of HOA president, effective immediately." The room exhaled in collective relief. Melissa stood up, her face pale. She looked around, as if searching for someone to stand with her. There was no one. "This isn't over," she said, her voice shaking with resentment, before turning and walking out. I watched her go. No satisfaction, no triumph, just a familiar feeling. The kind you get when you know someone has lost power, but not obsession. And people like that, when pushed off one stage, always look for another. From that moment on, everything had moved beyond the HOA. And Melissa, whether she accepted it or not, had stepped into the most dangerous part of this story. I realized everything had gone beyond the HOA the moment my security camera sent a motion alert close to midnight. And the image that appeared was not a stray cat or the wind, but Melissa Grant. She was standing right at the edge of my driveway, wearing a bright reflective vest like a public works employee, holding a measuring tape, bending down to measure the distance between my tire and the curb, muttering something the camera could not pick up. The timestamp on the screen read 11:47 in the evening, an hour when no one has any legitimate reason to be conducting a so-called community vehicle assessment. I stood in my dark living room, watching the scene without needing to guess. Melissa had not accepted being removed from the HOA. She had only changed roles. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The hinge creaked softly. Melissa spun around, startled. In that instant, the shell of authority she wore cracked. "You startled me," she said quickly, trying to regain her composure. "I'm conducting an independent evaluation." "At nearly midnight," I replied. "I have authority," she said, lifting a stack of papers. "Under a neighborhood monitoring initiative." I looked at the papers. No logo, no seal, no registration number. Just hastily printed text trying to look legitimate. "You're standing on private property," I said, "and you're being recorded." Melissa stiffened. I saw it clearly. What she hated most was being documented, because her power only existed when there were no witnesses. "You're obstructing justice," she snapped. You can't stop me from protecting the community. You're trespassing, I said, my voice no louder but firmer. And this is the last time. Melissa stepped back, then another step. She said nothing more. She turned and walked quickly into the darkness. But I knew this was not retreat. This was panic. The next morning, I sent the entire recording to Internal Affairs. No commentary, no emotion, just data. And data does not argue. By afternoon, I received a call. Short, direct. We have enough, the voice on the other end said. Harassment, impersonation of an organization, illegal fee collection, and now nighttime trespassing. I did not feel relief. I felt a deep stillness, the kind you feel when you know everything has left your hands and is being placed exactly where it belongs. A patrol car stopped in front of Melissa's house later that afternoon. I did not watch, but I heard voices echo down the quiet street. Melissa's voice was high, rushed, breaking apart. She talked about misunderstandings, about good intentions, about the community. No one argued with her. There was no need. When Melissa stepped outside holding the papers she had been given, her face was no longer angry. It was empty, as if she had finally realized that power is not something you print out and force others to believe in. A restraining order, an order to cease all self-appointed activities, a criminal warning if she reoffended. Everything was read clearly, coldly, without emotion. Melissa screamed, not in anger, but in collapse. The scream of someone who had just lost the only thing that made them feel real. That night, the neighborhood was strangely quiet. No notices, no emails, no papers taped to poles. I stood on my porch, looking at the empty driveway that had once been staked, booted, measured like occupied territory. Ted waved from across the street. Jill sent a short message. Thank you. I did not reply right away. I just stood there and took a deep breath. Not because of victory, but because I knew that with people like Melissa, stories rarely end cleanly. They do not learn lessons. They simply look for another place to begin again. And as night fell, I understood that the hardest part was over. But the aftershocks, the cracks left behind by fabricated power, would remain for a long time. Not to remind me, but to remind the entire neighborhood that real order does not come from clipboards, paperwork, or loud voices. It comes from boundaries, and from people calm enough to defend those boundaries all the way to the end. Melissa Grant vanished from the neighborhood faster than any HOA notice she had ever taped to a light pole. But the story was not over. It had only changed locations. 1 week after that night, just when I thought everything had finally settled down, a strange envelope appeared at my front door. Thick paper, off-white, stamped with a round gold seal. No return address. Just a single line printed with deliberate care, as if trying to prove its seriousness. North District Neighborhood Oversight Initiative. Inside was an invitation letter. A demand to attend a mandatory mediation session. Attached was a suggestion for a voluntary contribution of $140 to support administrative costs. At the bottom was a familiar signature, neatly written, confident, as if it had never collapsed. M. Grant, Acting Coordinator. I stood in my living room for a long time, the letter in my hand. Not angry, not surprised. Just one clear realization. Melissa had not learned a lesson. She had only changed the name on the door. That evening, the security camera triggered another motion alert. This time it was at the gate. Melissa stood there wearing a dark coat, holding a large poster board. On it was a photo of my truck, circled in red, annotated with arrows and dramatic phrases. Driveway dominance risk. Visual imbalance. She held the sign up like a misunderstood prophet, convinced her truth still deserved to be seen. I did not step outside. I watched through the screen. No more words were needed. No more confrontation. Because I knew everything that mattered had already been recorded. The next morning, the call came. "We'll handle it," the voice on the other end said. Calm, firm. She's crossed every boundary. That afternoon, a patrol car stopped in front of Melissa's house. This time, there was no arguing, no explaining. Just paperwork handed directly to her. A cease order, a final warning, and consequences if she continued. Melissa did not scream. She did not argue. She just stood there, staring at the papers as if they were final proof that the performance had truly ended. When she got into her car and drove away, no one in the neighborhood came out to watch. No one stood at their windows. The silence that followed was not cold. It was collective relief. In the days that followed, the neighborhood returned to normal in a way I had never realized was so valuable. No flyers, no late-night emails, no one measuring driveways with metal rulers. Leonard, the new HOA president, stopped by one afternoon with a jar of homemade jam. He did not say much, just one sentence. "We're going to do things differently." I nodded. That was enough. A few months later, a friend who worked at the county records office called me. "You should see this," she said. On her desk was a new HOA registration file for a development a few dozen miles away. Sloppy paperwork, copied bylaws, but the name listed as president was unmistakable. Melissa Grant. "Are you going to warn them?" she asked. I shook my head. Not out of indifference, but because I understood something only people who have faced that kind of fabricated power truly understand. Some lessons cannot be explained. They can only be experienced. That afternoon, I drove home and parked my pickup in the empty driveway, the same place that had once been staked, booted, and measured like conquered territory. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the soft wind moving through the trees. Peaceful. Truly peaceful. Melissa Grant might be somewhere else now, with a new clipboard, a new title, and a community that has no idea what it is about to face. But this story ends here. And if you are listening to this right now, I want to ask you something. If one day someone stands at your front door, demanding your car keys in the name of the community, what would you do? Would you stay silent? Or would you protect your boundaries? If this story made you think, leave a comment, share your perspective. And if you want to hear more stories about fabricated authority, about Karen stories and HOA stories where the truth ultimately wins, follow along so you do not miss the next one.